Hello, I'm Steve Gilroy. I'm the founder of Gilroy's and one of the first 4 pioneering micro-brewers in South Africa. Sitting with me is Mike Billion. Mike is now the head brewer at Gilroy's and general manager of the whole brewing side of Gilroy's. Together, we're going to take you on a journey. We're going to take you on a miraculous, an incredible journey. It's the journey of beer, from grain to glass. Beer is the oldest and most majestic alcoholic beverage. Its history can be traced back 6,000 years. But what is beer? Beer is any alcoholic beverage brewed from fermented, malted, cereal grain. The main ingredient for beer is barley. Look, some brewers put maize or wheat in with their barley, even oats, even rice. They do this to create all the different styles in beer, and also sometimes to cut down on the costs. At Gilroy's, we only use barley. We keep it pure. But let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about what happens to that little barley grain. How it becomes a barley malt. We're going to tell you what the maltsters actually do. This is the first step in this long journey. The grain is germinated. The maltster soaks the grain to start germination. This is a cross-section of a single barley grain, one of nature's miracles. On the dorsal side is the embryo. This is the little baby plant. This whole section is the endosperm. It's mostly starch, and at this stage it's very hard, aptly described as steely, far too hard to feed the little embryo. But as the acrospire, the shoot, starts to grow, so the most amazing changes take place. Numerous enzymes are produced to break down the steely endosperm, and it becomes softer. The perfect food to get the little plant started. This is called natural modification and starts near the embryo, the little embryonic plant. As the acrospire continues to grow, right to the top of the grain, so the modification continues at the same rate. In the final stages, the endosperm is like a little lunchbox full of food to feed the little plant until its roots are functional. This starch is broken down to sugars by the enzymes formed during germination. It's these simple fermentable sugars that brewer's yeast metabolizes to create the alcohol and carbon dioxide in the beer. At this stage, the maltster starts to kiln the grain, gently at first, to stop germination and to dry it. Temperatures are raised during curing, which develops the flavour and the colour. This light gold colour is perfect barley malt. So there it is. The mystery is solved. Now you know exactly what malt is. This is where Mike takes over, and he's going to show you every stage in the brewing process at Gilroy's.
Follow me into the brewery and I'll show you what we do.
Milling the barley malt is the first critical step in the brewing process at Gilroy's. The crush must be perfect, enough to expose the starchy endosperm without chewing up the husk. The husks become a natural filter bed later in the process, during lautering and sparging. The mashing process is where the proteolytic enzymes developed during malting convert the starch into sugars, simple fermentable sugars and complex sugars. These extracted sugars, dissolved in water, result in what we call sweet wort. The crushed grain is added to prepared water in the mash tun. The starting temperature of the water depends on the type of beer to be brewed. Temperatures are critical in this process. Too low and the proteolytic enzymes required to break down the starch will not be activated. Too high and they will be destroyed. The success of the mash depends on the temperature ramps and rests. The mash is stirred continuously to make sure the entire mixture has a uniform temperature. After 90 minutes of mashing, the conversion of starch into sugar is complete. The sweet wort must now be cleaned and separated from the grain. This process is called lautering. First, the temperature of the mixture is raised to reduce sugar viscosity. The sweet wort is pumped from the bottom of the mash basket and returned to the top. Here, the husks of the spent grain form a natural filter bed which clarifies the sweet wort. When clean, the solution is then pumped to the boiling kettle. There is still a lot of concentrated sweet wort trapped inside the filter bed. This is rinsed out using temperature-controlled pure water and sent through to the boiling kettle too. This is called sparging. In the boiling kettle, the sweet wort is boiled for 90 minutes. Here, hops are added to counter the sweetness of the wort. The solution is now called a bitter wort. The boil sterilizes the liquid and helps to further clarify it by coagulating proteins and forcing them out of solution. It also drives off any volatile components and gases. During the boil, sugars and amino acids undergo chemical reactions to form complex flavor compounds called melanoidins. Sugars are also caramelized and add to the overall flavor profile of the finished product. Different hops are added to the boil at certain stages and in specific quantities. Alpha and beta acids in the hops give the distinct bitterness and aroma characteristics respectively. These can range from a flowery, fruity spiciness to a robust earthiness. Beer without hops would not taste like beer as we know it. At the end of the boil, the bitter wort is whirlpooled. The centripetal force acting on the liquid moves any heavy, undissolved particulate, known as trub, to the center of the bottom of the kettle, where it forms a neat cone. The whirlpool clarifies the liquid by separating the trub from the bitter wort and keeps the trub isolated for when we empty the tank. After boiling, the wort is pumped through a heat exchange where the temperature is dramatically and instantly lowered. The bitter wort passes through the heat exchange and into a primary fermenter where fermentation will take place. Once again, the temperatures here are critical and are regulated depending on the type of yeast used and its optimum working temperature.
These are primary fermenters, where fermentation starts. When yeast is pitched into the wort, it begins to consume any available oxygen in the wort. This stage of metabolism is called respiration. The yeast, during this time, begins to multiply, and this stage takes about 24 hours. When all of the oxygen is being consumed, the yeast then switches over to its second form of metabolism, fermentation. Here, the yeast metabolizes any available sugars in the wort, and in doing so, creates an equal number of molecules of both ethanol alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. In total, primary fermentation takes about 5 days for ales and 10 days for lagers. During this stage, the wort becomes a beer. Generally speaking, there are two main types of yeast used in beer production: lager yeasts and ale yeasts. Lager yeasts work better at relatively low temperatures, and they can ferment more complex sugars in the beer. Ale yeasts are happier at higher temperatures, where they develop warmer, more complex flavors in the beer. During fermentation, yeast adds many wonderful flavor compounds which add to the great taste of beer. One of which, however, is an undesired component called diacetyl. Diacetyl adds a sweet, unpleasant, buttery flavor to the beer and must be removed. Fortunately, at the end of fermentation, yeast begins to correct its sins by taking up and thereby reducing the amount of diacetyl in the beer. This process favors slightly warmer temperatures, so at the end of fermentation, we raise the temperature ever so slightly for the yeast to do its final work. After primary fermentation, the young beer is then pumped into a secondary fermentation vessel. It's important to remove the fresh beer from the dormant yeast in the bottom of the cone, as these yeast cells can negatively impact on the flavour of the fresh beer. Live yeast cells, still active in solution, will still produce CO2 gas and alcohol, but at a slower rate. This vessel features a sealed lid, which traps the newly produced CO2 gas, forcing it back into solution and creating the natural low carbonation in Gilroy beer. These vessels are moved into our cold rooms, where the beer is allowed to condition and mature. Conditioning takes up to 3 weeks. A much asked question is, how do we control fermentation and alcohol content in the beer? The answer is, we don't. Nature does it. The yeast feeds on the available sugars in the wort, and when those sugars are used up, the yeast stops producing alcohol. So, the amount of alcohol content in the wort is directly proportional to the amount of grain in the mash and the sugars extracted from it. To determine how much alcohol is produced, we use a hydrometer. A hydrometer measures the specific gravities of the beer. The specific gravities are the concentration of dissolved sugars in the wort relative to distilled water as a reference. Because alcohol is lighter than water, the gravity decreases as fermentation proceeds. We measure the gravity at the beginning of fermentation and at the end, and it's this change in gravity that allows us to calculate how much alcohol was produced.
After conditioning, the beer is ready to drink, but may still contain dormant yeast cells and undissolved proteins. We filter our beer to remove these particles and achieve crystal clear beer. The beer is chilled through a heat exchange, passed through the filter, and pumped into a holding tank called the Bright Beer Tank. Gilroy beer is now ready for kegging and bottling. The bottled beer is pasteurized to maintain Gilroy's legendary shelf life. The bottles are then labeled, packed, and ready for the stores.
There it is, a series of miracles from grain to glass. When you're drinking Gilroy beer from a bottle, please don't freeze it. You're going to lose the flavours. And the natural low carbonation in the beer is going to go back into solution and it's going to appear flat. Drink it cool, coldish, never frozen. This is how you pour the beer. Let it crash into an upright glass. Then it'll achieve the desired head. A thing of beauty and a joy forever. So, that's how we make the beer.
And this is how we drink it.
Magic!